الله الرحمن الرحيم إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد السلام عليكم ورحمة الله. We're on Hadith number 14 of the 40 Hadith. This is, in one sense, a very short and simple one. And from another angle, there is some trickiness involved in it, possibly explaining it. So let's look at the Hadith. Imam Nawawi rahimahullah ta'ala relates in his Kitab al-Arba'in, the 40 Hadith. عن ابن مسعود رضي الله عنه قال قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا يحل ذم عمر مسلم إلا بإحدى ثلاث الثيب الزاني والنفس بالنفس وتارك لدينه المفارق للجماعة رواه البخاري ومسلم. On the authority of Ibn Mas'ud, may Allah be pleased with him, radiyallahu anhu, who said, the Messenger of Allah, sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, may the blessing and peace of Allah be upon him, said, the blood of a Muslim may not be legally spilt other than in one of three instances. The married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and one who forsakes his religion and abandons the community. The blood of a Muslim may not be legally spilt other than in one of three instances: a married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and one who forsakes his religion and abandons the community. Hadith number 14 is on the one hand, hadith number 14 is very theoretical because it's not something that we could practice here, nor do we seek to practice here. Why? Because these things are related to governance and the state, not to individuals. Okay, so it's going to be, it's not something that we could go outside and put into practice, like other hadiths about intentions and charity and wishing for your brother that which you wish for yourself. This is something which is more right now academic, nonetheless important. Here, the Prophet ﷺ is talking about had punishments for which crimes for which the punishment is execution by death. لا يحل دم عمري Muslim. It's not halal to take the blood of a Muslim إلا بإحدى ثلاث, except in one of three cases or instances. So here we're talking about the state punishing by death a man or a woman who has committed one of these three crimes. The first is zina. Zina can refer to adultery, someone married having illegitimate or illicit sexual relationships outside of his marriage or her marriage. Zina can also apply to fornication. That is to say, an unmarried man or an unmarried woman having illicit sexual relationships outside of the bonds of marriage. However, in this instance, we're referring to a married person, man or woman, who still married but has committed adultery. Okay? Now the one that they may have committed adultery with may or may not be married, but that person is married. That husband is married, or it could be the woman, that wife is married. Is that clear? So a few things to dispel first and foremost. Sometimes it seems, especially when the media get hold of an issue, that, adultery, or the punishment for adultery, only applies to a woman. And that's not true at all. That's not true at all. The punishment for adultery applies to a man or and a woman. Okay, that's one thing. Second thing is that the Sharia, either through the Quran or through the authentic Hadith, the Sunnah, have certain deterrents which are incredibly harsh. And they are harsh because they need to be effective deterrents against certain crimes that are from amongst the worst crimes a person can commit. So, 3 crimes have been given here for which it's death, the punishment is death by execution or by stoning, as it comes or as it relates according to the traditional classical understanding of this issue. Islam comes out of the 6,235 or 36 verses of the Quran. About less than 15, probably about 10, deal with capital punishment at this level. Out of 6,236 verses, 10 of them deal with capital punishment. Again, it's another misnomer, another kind of misunderstanding. Again, the media tends to have a large part to play in this as well. That somehow the majority of the Quran, or half the Quran, or a really significant number of verses of the Quran deal with capital punishments. They don't. But the verses that do deal with it, the 10 odd verses that do deal with it, are very strict and very down the line in terms of what punishment they prescribe for certain crimes and infringements against the law. And as I said, that's simply because, like other systems of laws and other societies, these punishments are meant to be, first and foremost, a deterrent to deter, to stop someone, to convict someone not to do the crime, because if you get caught, it's going to be incredibly bad for you. So first and foremost, they are a deterrent. Secondly, in terms of the Islamic laws, if a person undergoes the punishment, it can be a cleansing of their sins. And thirdly, those punishments are there to ensure that individual criminality in society doesn't become infectious and spread far and wide because, well, the law is a bit soft on crime. And so people think, well, let me have a go as well. Because there is the base human nature. Following one's ego, one's whims and desires, that's always there. The devil is whispering. So if the punishments are very, very strong and sturdy, then law works effectively as a deterrent. The second main theme that I want to get from here, that the blood of a Muslim may not be legally spilled other than in one of three instances: a married person who commits adultery, a life for a life, and one who forsakes his religion and leaves the community, meaning one who apostatizes. So there is adultery, murder, and apostasy mentioned here, all of which are major crimes in Islam, all of which have capital punishment, and in this case, these three, all of which the capital punishment is death. Stoning of the adulterer or the adulteress, and the execution of the murderer or the apostate. Now, until recent times, until maybe the 1960s or 70s, definitely by the 80s, a lot of countries, even in the West, didn't find that too unusual, that there are some really harsh punishments. Most Western European countries found them incredibly harsh, because by the late 60s or by the 70s, hardly any Western European country had death as a punishment. I mean, I can't remember the dates specifically, but really by the end of the 60s or by the end of the mid-70s, the death penalty for any crime was waived. Why? Because it was seen to be cruel, unnecessary, and barbaric. In the United States of America, the death penalty was differed upon by the population. Some states and large number of people, following the trend in Western Europe and that kind of philosophical thought, and thought it was barbaric, and other states in the United States, even as we speak today, still have the death penalty for some heinous crime. But by and large, Western liberal democracies and the trends that they set around the globe, economically, philosophically, culturally, tend to look down very, very bitterly against the notion of death penalties. And the only system that still raises its voice at some level to advocate the death penalty tend to be Muslims. Not all Muslims, because in this case Muslims can be divided into three groups for this discussion. There are those modern liberal Muslims who they are just too eager to follow the way of the liberal West, and are quite comfortable in turning their backs on traditional understanding of the religious texts, only because their hearts have been are drowning in or have been baptized by alien philosophies outside of the Islamic teachings. Such people tend not to be very beneficial to any Muslim community, and tend not to be beneficial in terms of bridging gaps between Muslim and non-Muslim communities. Why? Because they don't represent the majoritarian voice. Their views are not based upon principles, but it's based upon their whims, desires, likes and dislikes. And thirdly, when they do engage with non-Muslim people like policymakers and government and counter-terrorist kind of thing, they are always going to give their own personal skewed view of what Muslims should or shouldn't be like, what Islam is or isn't. And therefore, you could be talking to one set of liberal Muslims and they would say this, and you could be talking to another set who will say something slightly different, and that doesn't give non-Muslim government, policymakers, and people like that any firm understanding of what the majority of us are actually about. So I would say they are actually quite redundant in any form or fashion, let alone theologically and religiously. They're totally disconnected from the tradition. The second group are those who are traditionally schooled, okay, but on a few of these issues, like capital punishment and stoning, whatever, they have taken a view counter to the majoritarian classical view. But these are people who are schooled in the traditional fiqh and the traditional legal understanding and sharia and hadith and whatever. But they have taken a slightly different position on some of these very kind of hot issues. And then the third group is, by and large, the vast majority, which still looks at these hadiths and say, well, okay, even if the environment isn't there, the social justice isn't there, poverty reigns supreme in many of our lands, as does corruption, and therefore we can't implement it now. But if there ever was a time where all of these things could get fixed properly, then these laws should come into play, because these are God's laws, and God has actually, in the Quran, through the tongue of the Prophet, legislated these laws. In Islam, there are three types of laws. Hudud, so you've heard of hudud, had punishment. Ta'zir, okay, and qisas. Hudud, ta'zir, and qisas, all from the Quran. Hudud are those punishments which really, it's left to Allah. Allah decides. Okay? Punishment of adultery, stoning to death. Causing corruption on the land, such as like acts of terror on the land, execution by crucifixion and chopping off opposite limbs after discussion and all that business, obviously. What else? Leaving apostasy, if it's done publicly, execution. These type of things, it is said that these are Allah's laws. Hudud. Hudud comes from the word had. Had means a boundary. And once someone steps over that boundary, then God insists this is the punishment that they're going to get. Ta'zir are best translated as discretionary punishments. These are crimes for which the punishment is left to the decision of the head of state. Should they imprison that person for such and such a crime, flog them, whip them, drag them through the streets, fine them? Those things in which the state or the ruler decides, they are called ta'zir, punishments. So, for example, if someone was really causing a nuisance and, like, I don't know, going around and getting their keys and scraping on everybody's cars to kind of just really damage the cars, I mean, there's nothing in the Quran that tells you that there's, what the punishment for such a crime is. And it certainly isn't like adultery and apostasy. Is it like drinking or whatever? Maybe, maybe not. But it's discretionary now. So the law of the Muslim ruler or the Muslim government will say, we'll fine such a person, or we'll flog such a person, or we'll banish such a person from this land or from this town, or something like that. And the third type of punishments are called qisas. Qisas are retributional punishments. It is punishments that the state feels, these are based upon the Quran, the state, that Allah says that the state should interfere in order to recompense the one who's been harmed or the family who has suffered a loss. And the reason for this is that this is one way of bringing about a type of healing, that there will be a type of retribution. So someone has murdered someone in such and such a family, that family can ask for the qisas, punishment of execution of that person. someone has broken the leg of someone in that family and that person can say, I want compensation, monetary compensation, or whatever that compensation may be. And in that way, it's felt that some level of justice has been done, and you can now put closure on the issue, and society can function at some type of normalcy. But if you leave the wounds unhealed, they continue to fester. I mean, so for example, if you think, like for example, when I was, in my youthful days, okay, as I was growing up, when I was like between, when I was 18, 20, or even slightly before that, we had the Hillsborough incident, okay, that huge football tragedy, okay, and does anyone remember Stephen Lawrence, the black kid who got killed? And even now, you still have hearings and investigations about the Hillsborough tragedy, even though it's been, in my mind, close to 20 years, if not more than that, 20 years or more? 25 years, right? Okay. Because certain people, especially families and relatives, feel that they haven't got justice done yet. And there's definitely more so the case with Stephen Lawrence. So Islam says that that's not a really good thing. So let's try to heal in these ways. And it's not just Islam. Many other legal systems in the past had it, and there is still some type of retributionary system that goes on in many legal systems today. The one that tends to jack up certain people's back, and the one that makes it a bit difficult for Muslims to discuss, at least with non-Muslim audience, are the hudud punishments. The capital punishments, especially when they involve death, stoning to death. Because the modern mind, quite understandably, the modern Western mind, quite understandably, can't associate and relate to those things anymore. But the modern Western mind, I suggest to you, can't relate to many traditional things that once upon a time will be considered quite normal for human beings, but now are considered abnormal. And the things that were considered quite abnormal for human beings are now becoming the norm day by day, hour by hour. Okay. And once you are raised in a particular atmosphere and environment, and you're coloured by your socialisation, your upbringing, sometimes it's very difficult for you to see a particular view. Okay. Anyway, so with that being said, let me quickly just go through the actual hadith. So the blood of a Muslim may not be legally spilled for other than one of three instances. The married person commits adultery. This is whether it's the wife and she commits adultery, or whether it's the husband and he goes and commits adultery. If 4 just witnesses witness the act of adultery, and it's really not worth asking, when will there ever be 4 witnesses, 3 witnesses, 2? When would anyone want to commit adultery in public? And kind of just text everyone, go, check it out on YouTube. Nevertheless, if 4 witnesses witness the act of adultery, or if the adulterer or the adulteress self-confess, then the state is obliged to execute the adulterer or the adulteress, as the case may be, through stoning. Through stoning. That all lands, majority Muslim lands today don't have that. 1 or 2 lands have it in writing that they will do it, but it doesn't happen. And most Muslim lands have, since colonialism, physical invasion by Western forces, or cultural invasion by Western ideas, most Muslim lands have given up on that. So no, we're not going to do that. In fact, most Muslim lands now have gravitated towards adultery doesn't seem to be a crime. It might individually shock and repel and disgust individual, but as per the state, then it's not recognized as a crime. Nevertheless, the Quran, the Hadith, see it as a crime until all times. See it as a crime for all times, and they see it as a crime monstrous enough that it will destroy the fabric of the moral fabric of a society. It might not stop scientific advancement and economic growth. It will stop moral and spiritual growth. No doubt at all. That is a given. The second one, a life for a life, which is also biblical, Old Testament wise. And the third one, apostasy. That is, a Muslim, we're talking about living in a Muslim country, a Muslim who then leaves Islam through choice and makes that known, meaning it's not done secretly, then the Prophet ﷺ said in the authentic hadith, Man baddala deenahu faqtaluhu. Whoever changes his religion, execute him or kill him. In our classical books of Islamic law, up until very recently, all of these three offences were very well fleshed out in terms of how the execution should take place and the reasons behind it, and with the underlying philosophy that it should be a deterrent, that it acts as a deterrent. When I first went to the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for my first Umrah, I think I was about, I think I might have been 16 or 17, or around about then, maybe 18, I don't know. I went to my uncle's house in Jeddah, and what I was surprised about, so this is back in the 80s, early 80s, and I used to hear stories from my cousins who had already gone to Umrah before me in the early 70s, that people would just leave their house door open, the few cars that were there, they would just be left open, many things could be left unattended. The sweet shop seller would just cover his stall of sweets and go to the Jummah, come back and find the money still there in the little jar or whatever he was using, and the sweets are still there. Now when you speak to Saudi nationals, okay, and this has been going on from the 90s onwards, okay, none of this is possible. Society has definitely changed. Okay, none of this is possible. Crime is rampant, theft is rampant, and the whole thing is in a downward spiral. Interestingly enough, there is a book, The Silent Takeover, not by Norina Hertz. I can't remember who wrote it. She's a really good writer, and she wrote this book about globalization back in maybe just before 9/11 or after 9/11, called The Silent Takeover. Anyway, she makes a very good point there. Okay, she says it's a non-Muslim writer. She says something like, above northern India, there is this little Buddhist country, Tibet. This little Buddhist country, really small. And before 1990, nearly everybody, they hardly had any tourists. The king and queen and the royal family were practicing Buddhists. Nearly everybody in that tiny country, probably Leytonstone or Waltham Forest is larger than the country and probably has more people than here than in that country, were all Buddhists. And Buddhist philosophy is like, you don't harm anybody and you don't do this and you spiritual growth, and that's exactly what the country was like. The kids at school were angels, and people did more breathing and alms and whatever and spiritual practices than anything. For some reason, the king felt pressurized by the early 90s to have one satellite dish in the country and to open the doors to some level of tourism, even though it would be trickles. And they were connected. Tourists would want to access some satellite. I mean, you come all the way from the United States and you can't see Friends, and you can't see wrestling, or you can't see the big game. That's going to be really bad. So get a satellite dish, whatever. This one satellite dish then started beaming, because that country didn't make its own programs or anything, started beaming mainly American TV. Within less than 3 or 4 years, according to, there was an article in the Times or the Guardian about this, and it's in this book, The Silent Takeover. Kids who then had been watching American wrestling for 2 or 3 years, and films that depicted some level of violence, and other kind of things of taking drugs and narcotics, violence then became visible in schools. And not just speaking back to the teacher, that was happening, or that happened, but actually physical violence, people coming in with, not everyone, but at least 2 cases of people a Buddhist kid taking a baseball bat to his teacher or to someone else in that Buddhist school. And 3 or 4 years ago, they were just like kids were in this country in 1930 when they were at school. Just sit down, yes sir, 3 bags, 4 sir, kind of thing. And whereas the traditional dress had been like a bit of a shalwar khamisi kind of Buddhist thing, right? They're now wearing t-shirts with AC/DC and heavy metal and Black Sabbath and whatever it be. Okay, even if they didn't really understand what was going on. And drug addiction became endemic there within 5 years. And many of those little temples and big temples, they had gold plating on their roofs. What was then beginning to happen is that they were being stolen. They were being stolen. It's just that I remember what happened on the housing estate that I grew up in. But anyway, they were being stolen by kids, mainly by kids, and also by certain adults trying to profit from selling gold foil when you burn it down and whatever you get. And none of this was there before the satellite dish. The book, Silent Takeover, and that particular article in that broadsheet newspaper, I think it was The Guardian, it could have been The Independent or Telegraph, it said that if there ever was a doubt as to whether television influences society, or is it the other way around, society influences TV? Does society mimic TV, or does TV mimic society? Which is kind of one of the big questions. They said that, at least in this incident, it's absolutely clear society mimicked TV. And the book, Silent Takeover, says there's no reason to think that it's not the same case in other societies as well, that society mimics TV more than the other way around. Even if you could show that, yes, TV mimics society here and there, but on the whole, it's the other way around. Which is why I'm still really amazed with those scholars. Okay, when I was growing up, I used to hear, people in the masjid, elders in the masjid, who would pray and fast and they had beards and whatever, and they'd always say, our ulama, they're too strict. Why too strict? Because they don't allow photographs of themselves, and they don't allow photographs of other people or whatever, unless it's for a necessity like a passport. Oh, you're too strict or whatever. And I used to think, what's wrong with pictures and photographs? And then you grow up a little bit, and then you hear about the hadith about that Allah curses the picture maker, and on the Day of Judgment, the picture maker will be told to breathe life into that picture of an animate creature that they drew, or they painted, or they sculpted, or whatever, and they won't be able to do so, and they will be punished as a major sin. And you think, but then you hear the other. Then very quickly another view came that that's right, sculptures and hand-drawn pictures, but cameras and then video cameras, they're all okay. That's how it was said. But even though there are still a significant sizable scholarly view that none of that is okay. But actually, if you look, just now stepping back, if you look at what has done the most moral, spiritual damage, cultural damage in the world today, to societies, it's not necessarily drugs or alcohol. It's the fact that pictures, the media and pictures. So we might find that some of these ulama, maybe Allah gifts them with long-term vision and insight based upon the text that us mere mortals don't have. What I'm trying to say is we need to kind of look into ourselves and understand that Allah has given us a way of life that is well designed for our needs, our welfare, our contentment, not our happiness, our contentment, and our entry into the hereafter. That's the type of confidence or yaqeen that we should have, although it is now questionable, do we have that or not? I can only teach you, and this is certainly not, I'm not saying that it's the mosque policy, but I can only teach you, as it's almost academic now, that there is no reason that these shouldn't be implemented in the right setup. Merely because one culture finds something harsh doesn't mean that that thing is wrong. Sometimes, and I'm not saying that all issues are culturally relative. No. There are some things that are universally known to be bad. Stealing is universally known to be bad, even if various cultures will differ how to deal with the thief. Okay? Disrespect towards people is universally bad, even if people may differ how they deal with disrespect. So there are certain wrongs and crimes that are universally accepted as being wrongs and crimes at some level. There are other wrongs and crimes that aren't universal, they're local. The thing that we need to wisely question, without getting into a huff and a puff about it. And if we don't have the wisdom, the temperament, or the language needed to do this, then we should just shut up. But if we do have, and the knowledge, then perhaps we should question what gives Britain, France, or the United States, or Western Europe in general, any moral superiority in terms of what is morally good and not, what is a barbaric punishment or not. What gives such countries and philosophies the right to dictate or feel that they're morally superior? Nothing to do with Islam. I could be a communist here, I could be a socialist, I could be a Rastafarian, I could be a Sikh, I could be whatever, okay? But what makes Western law and its view on what is and isn't moral or morality, and what should or shouldn't be punished, what gives them the right? Do we live in a country with all of its goods that it has so much good, okay? Do we live in a country in which crime is hardly ever seen? Or do we live in a country in which crime is out of control, even if politicians in various governments always fiddle the figures. Do we live in a country where drug abuse, substance abuse, has almost disappeared, or is increasing exponentially day by day? Do we live in a country that is now so overly sexualized that sex crimes are happening all round? Kids are being exposed to the nastiest activities and pictures sexually. Is that getting better, or is it getting worse? And that's not talking about corporate crime, crimes that corporations do. Right? Okay. I'm just talking about individuals. Forget about crimes that Western European, Western American corporations, Goldman Sachs, for example, that last major economic downturn that we had, kind of we still have, but started in 2008, kind of 2009, and it kind of starts in America because of selling those subprime mortgages to people who who couldn't pay. Who was behind that? Who was really right underneath and behind that? It was Goldman Sachs, the most powerful bank in the world. Okay. And today, Goldman Sachs hasn't paid for any of those crimes because they destroyed not just other smaller banks and other banks who became too greedy, and not only kind of frauded a lot, but they sent the whole world in a course of great harm. Okay, if you're a Greek, or if you're especially if you're a Greek, but even if you're an Italian or a Spanish, okay, who now lives totally other than how your parents were living, okay, that's really Goldman Sachs. What I'm trying to say though is there are corporations like that that will never be accountable for any of their immoralities or crimes. And government, unfortunately our government included, seem to always pander to such corporations. But at least the Muslim should feel a sense of injustice, at least, because it is unjust. But not just against this. I mean, let me wind back the clock as well. It was this Stephen Lawrence case. I remember being brought up with a lot of black people and Afro-Caribbean people just down the road there in Cathal Road Estate. Before it became houses, it was a large block of flats. Okay, and they were nearly almost all Afro-Caribbean. 80% of the estate, or 70% of the estate was. One of the things I kind of noticed as a Muslim is that we were always talking about justice and fighting, speaking against injustice, but the Muslims never had a word to say about Stephen Lawrence. High public profile. Never did any one of our leaders, as far as I'm aware, or any one of us said, look, that's an injustice at a really serious level. Where we do talk about justice and injustice is only when it deals with Muslims. But the Quran doesn't say that. The Quran orders us to be just to everybody and speak about injustice, whoever it is or wherever it is. When we become tribal and justice is only between us, and who cares if injustice is happening, we're not upon the way of the Prophet ﷺ. How can we be upon his sunnah? Anyway, so these three, according to classical teachings, have a capital punishment, death by execution or stoning. And yes, it is very harsh, and yes, it is it's cruel in that sense, but it has its philosophy, underlying philosophy is it's meant to be a deterrent. The only thing I'll say is we have seen tragically that when whoever is in government or whoever has executive power, if anyone who has overall country power takes one piece of Islam and doesn't have the other jigsaw pieces or parts of Islam, and they try to make it work, it tends not only not to work, it tends to fail in a very ugly and abysmal way. So if you then, that is to say, how can it be sensible, this is a question rather than a declaration, how can it be sensible to say that I as the ruler, will implement the punishment for stealing when there is mass poverty and social injustices rampant in society? How can what would be the wisdom in implementing the punishment for adultery when I, as the ruler, have actively encouraged satellite TVs, you want to get whatever you want from whatever things, okay, the triple X, the quadruple X, or whatever, and that's all there, and turn a blind eye to it, and then all of a sudden I want to stop. And not only that, you have movies movies and magazines that tell you that the ideal woman, she should be as thin as the width of this page, right? That's the ideal. And there you kind of like keep seeing that, and images make an imprint. Okay, images make an imprint. Hormones still run, and you see that, and you're not lowering your gaze, and actually it works way into, at some level, it could impact on your marriage. In fact, surveys have been done in the United States, and when I was invited to Canada for one of its Muslim conferences, about 8 years ago, the RIS conference in Canada, which about 16,000 people attend, there was a lady there who actually spoke, a non-Muslim lady who spoke about her recent research on how pornography has interfered in the lives of countless Canadians and Americans, meaning North American people, and how it's become a huge problem in destroying marriages. Why? Because men, not all men, but men then want their wives to look in a particular way, and after a child or two children, after a particular age, after this, it's just not possible. And therefore, since the man has got these images, desires have been activated and everything else, and wife is not going to be like that, puts a huge strain, unbearable strain on marriage. That happens today here as well, in the UK, and it happens amongst more so the younger Muslim population. I can't tell you how many times I've sat down with young couples, okay, 20, 22, 23, that kind of age, going through problems, and have to kind of pull aside the husband saying, bro, what are you expecting for your wife? You've got 2 kids, and what you expect? You need to stop watching films. He goes, how do you know I'm watching films? So where else are you going to get those images from, and that stupidity from, that women should be like this regardless of what? So it's all affecting us, okay? It's a real problem. As regards to the life one, apostasy, it becomes even more problematic for Muslims because more than any other one, it doubly or triply violates the conventional United Nations human rights teachings, because one of the conventions of human rights says everyone should have the right to freely choose his or her religion or irreligion, as the case may be. To that answer, it's I once said in a very, probably wasn't the best thing to say, but someone once asked me that, doesn't that violate the human rights? I said, well, look, whether or not it violates the human rights, that's another discussion which we don't have time for. But nonetheless, if we're talking about human rights, no, it doesn't. So what, you're saying that a Muslim can choose to be a non-Muslim? I said, absolutely. Yes, he can. Yes, she can. And I said, they can choose. Then they asked me, and if in a Muslim society they're, with all the Sharia working fully and all justice and everything, and they chose, and they publicly announced it, what would happen? They would be asked to repent or executed. But they still had a choice to be a Muslim or a non-Muslim, so there is their right. We have just to remember 2 things. One, that these things need to be done wisely. 2, these things have no practicality because in this country, because we're not calling for hard punishments. In fact, many wise minds, Muslim minds, will tell you that actually we're quite content with the secularism that is here, because without it, there will always be religious witch hunts or minority witch hunts. Okay? Imagine if we all got together and said, we don't want homosexuals to be allowed to marry, because we don't accept homosexuality, okay, as a valid relationship between two human beings. Okay? But imagine if we all, and just imagine for some reason we got our way, then what that would do, it would say in this country that not every minority has a right to practice what they want. Not every minority has a right to certain civil arrangements. Well, if it starts with one minority, further down the line, another large set of people will say to the government and campaign, we don't want that minority to have other certain rights. And we should be clearly sensitive to this, because we're already on the firing line in terms of our morality, in terms of the way we slaughter, in terms of a number of ways that we may conduct family. And we should realise that actually what will stop that is if Britain was true to its liberal secular philosophy, which is that as long as it doesn't violate the law or harm another individual, then why should you worry how I slaughter my meat or not? Why should you worry whether I believe homosexuality is a good thing or a bad thing? As long as I'm not harming anyone, calling for death, punishment or harm, or breaking the law, but we are actually in a time in which there is a confusion there with Muslims. So if anything, how do you restore that? You probably, and this is not a fatwa, this is just thinking out loud, that might be best restored by actually bolstering the root principle that everyone should have their right to practice as long as it doesn't violate those two principles. Even though in our hearts, in our teachings, that is wrong, that is wrong, that is... But then the whole thing of kufr is wrong, right? The whole thing of kufr is wrong. But we still deal with it in a sensible, wise way. We engage with it when we need to, and we refrain from it when we want to, when we feel we have to or want to, and so on and so forth. So Muslims really need to wise up of what they do and what they don't do in this country. And Allah Jalla wa Ala knows best. If someone wants to read these, not the liberal view, but the view of certain traditional scholars who are saying that the punishment for adultery is not necessarily execution, even though that is the opinion of the 4 schools and the 4 Imams, and many scholars have even quoted an ijma', consensus on it. But just to be fair for this discussion, if someone wants to see that, they can read, for example, Sheikh Ali Juma, who was the former Mufti of Egypt, a great scholar in the traditional sciences, mashallah, a very great scholar, really well, mashallah. And you can see his account in responses from the tradition when he's asked the question number 18, inshallah. However, his view here that actually apostasy doesn't warrant death. There are incidences in the time of the Prophet ﷺ that he let the apostate go and he did this, which is all true because some of them are in Bukhari, Muslim or whatever. However, the end of the age, and taking all the hadiths into consideration, and taking the actions of the Khulafa, Rashidun, and those who followed them, and the Imams who came after them, Islam settled on that apostasy is punishable by death. They all both agree, Sheikh Ali Juma and the majority view, the traditional view, that it is a crime. Okay, but some people are now differing. What should be that? What should be the punishment? And I don't know if the view of these righteous, who I believe to be righteous scholars, learned righteous scholars, I don't know if their view is influenced by Western imperialism or culturalism of West, or whether even if we were still dominant, they would have come to this conclusion. I would hope and like to think that they would have come to this conclusion irrespective, but something inside of me tells me that the cultural dominance of the liberal West has had a role to play in that, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best now.